Hello and welcome back to the Arturia Synthi tutorial series. Another preset deep dive for you today. Picked this bend saw preset and let's see what it sounds like. And that's quite an interesting sound, and we'll cover it last. It's actually accomplished by this little pin here. I'm going to turn that off, and then we don't have to listen to that high-pitched whine, but we will come back to it. It's interesting. Okay, first things first, let's have a quick look at the pin setup. You can see that there's a ton of stuff pouring into the filter. All three oscillators are getting in on the action, and we've got a noise generator. All of that stuff's going into the filter, out of the filter into the envelope, out of the envelope to two locations. The first one is going straight to output channel 1. The second one is going into the reverb unit and out of the reverb unit to channel 2. So it's the same sound, it's just that one of them's going through the reverb. So now that we've taken that high-pitched whine away, that's the mix of those two sounds. And just so that I don't have to wait quite so long in between each of those key presses, I'm just going to turn the delay down a little bit, makes it slightly less ridiculous. So first things first, output channel 1, and then the reverb, the internal reverb system. We've got two reverbs in this sound. See, it's a pretty big fat reverb, full mix. So now that we've identified that channel B, as far as this part of the synth is concerned, is simply an internal reverb copy of the original, I'm actually going to throw that away, which means we don't need that pin anymore, and bring the original sound back. And now we can set about deconstructing that sound to figure out how it's getting its tone. It's a really interesting, harmonically rich sound. And I think the best way to attack it is one oscillator at a time. I'm going to get us right back down to just oscillator 1. I'm going to point one thing out before we do anything else. I'm pressing a C on the keyboard here, but you're actually hearing a G. We'll get to that later. So all three oscillators, keyboards 1, 2 and 3, they're all mapped to oscillator frequency, so they're all being tuned correctly across the keyboard. And obviously we've got a ton of other stuff, and now that we've thrown almost everything away from the pin matrix, all of the interest from this point onwards with just oscillator 1 is coming from our advanced pages. Now there is a lot going on in these advanced pages, and it's a little bit like this. So we need to kind of pick quite carefully between these various pages to get to the bottom of what's going on. And the first thing that I'm going to do is throw away the reverb, the advanced reverb. Okay, just get rid of that. It's a pretty straightforward stock reverb, and it's just polluting the sound a little bit. I'm also going to throw these two effects away, but I will have to bring them back later. So we've got an overdrive and a compressor. So we're getting a much simpler sound at this point, having thrown all that stuff away. The Synthi V doesn't really do regular shapes. Everything is complex in one way or another. Let's jump up to the functions page and have a look what's going on here. Absolutely action-packed. So I'm going to turn 4 of these effects off, and we're going to start with the channel 1 pan. Let's try to hone in on that. So it's almost kind of a square wave. We've got these flattened tops for the what's effectively a sine. But it's causing this kind of ping pong effect between our ears. So that's channel 1 pan set to 27%. Just crank it up a bit. While we're concentrating on channel 1 pan, this function down here, take a note that it's function number 4. So functions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and if we hop over to the modulations page, you can see that function 4 amount is being modulated over here as well. So we've got two different effects interacting with each other to generate this pan. One of them is the flattened sine wave that we just saw, but the second is an independent LFO inside the modulations page, and it's a sine wave LFO, and this fella is adding additional modulation to the pan amount. So it's increasing and decreasing the amount of pan, whilst the primary function over here takes care of the actual pan. So this is the amount of this pan that's being modulated, but it's being done via an LFO, so it's constantly changing the amount of variation. If I throw that away and go back over here, it's basically like me going up and down with the percentage value in a sine wave manner. Don't forget, sine waves aren't linear. The whole point of a sine wave is that it's constantly changing. Next one is our filter frequency. Got this little bump, or this inverted bump. Let's see what that sounds like. So it's dulling the sound. Let's really accentuate it. And then bring it back up to make it more subtle. And this is a bit of a false positive function number 2, because it's oscillator 1 saw level. You can see it's set to 0%. So I actually have to manually change this in order to get any value out of it. Now I don't know whether or not this is preset designers being caught between two stools, or whether or not these are Easter eggs designed to be found. Because if we have a quick look over at the joystick page, which isn't inherently interesting because everything's set to 0, everything is actually mapped. So if we increase all of these values to kind of bring the joystick into the party, can you see that oscillator 1 saw level is being modulated here as well? So it seems like there was a push to play with the oscillator 1 saw level, but by default, you know, with the preset as given, none of this stuff is actually in use. While we've got all of these set, let's have a bit of a play with the joystick and see what they sound like if we decide to use them. Remember when I said I have to bring the overdrive and compression back in? It's because they're mapped over here. Let's turn them back on. And now some kind of nice gritty stuff down here. I feel like don't know, beachcomber and trying to find the good spots. Oscillator 2 is not on at the moment. We'll come back to that shortly. And here we've got another FX dry wet value being modulated. So I'll briefly bring the reverb unit back in, and then we can see that the reverb is kind of pulsing quite quickly actually. And you're getting that kind of humming effect as the reverb gets boosted. I appreciate that we're doing a lot of jumping between pages, but that's because all of these controls are interconnected and there's no choice. Having messed with that sound so much, I'm actually going to throw it away, get back to our bass sound, throw those away again, and now let's have a look at oscillator 2. Now I could do this and just put oscillator 2 on and you hear it, but that's only really telling half the story, because oscillator 2 is hard synced to oscillator A. If you look at the dials, oscillator 1 says G3, oscillator 2 says A4. So I would expect ordinarily to hear different pitches from those pins. But of course, because it's hard synced, oscillator 2 is taking its pitch from 1. So it doesn't matter what I do with this knob, this is a tone control. I'm changing the shape of the hard sync. I'm not changing the pitch. So all this stuff is just providing tonal colour, and then when we bring the original oscillator back in, it thickens it out even more. You may recall oscillator 2 had a value in the functions page, so let's focus on that. We got another little one of these funny bumps. Let's accentuate it. So this is the oscillator 2 frequency, which remember isn't a frequency, it's a tonal control because it's hard synced to 1, and you get that little meow kind of effect. So that's 1 and 2. And oscillator 3, I'm going to press every time I press a key it's always the C. But now we've got a different pitch. Oscillator 3, annoyingly, is set to 131 Hz, which is actually C. Don't know why they've turned quantization off. But when I bring oscillator 1 back in, those two notes are a perfect fifth apart. So we're getting this dirty, gritty kind of power chord thing going on. It's the combination of those basically 3 oscillators, even though 2 of them are synced together, that's producing the fatness of sound. Now when we start to bring all of this good stuff back in, it just gets thicker and richer. Well, that one's not in use at the moment. Then we bring the panning modulation in. This is the LFO affecting the pan. One last component to bring back in, which is the noise. Noise is noise, but it's good. It's a good flavour filler. And finally, I'll just listen to it on its own. And then with the oscillators, so when you know it's there and you're listening for it, you can just about hear it adding harmonic colour. And as we saw at the outset, then all of that is basically replicated and sent through the reverb unit. So that's essentially the synthesizer's sound. Then we've got the elephant in the room, which is the Group B pin. Let's have a chat about that. And while I'm introing it, I'm just confirming that we don't need anything else at all in the pin matrix in order to be able to hear that sound. In fact, I can throw all the functions away. We know we've not got any joystick settings. We do need those for the moment. I can throw that away and that. I didn't talk about the modulation wheel, but that's basically just varying the reverb amount. Take that away. So this is all we're left with. We've stripped almost the entire sound away, and it doesn't seem that anything that we do has a blind bit of difference on that sound, a kind of feedbacky sound, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that it's feedback, but it actually isn't. This is output channel 1 feeding into output channel 2, and this is just the synthesizer's default natural state that there are almost no effects in play. The way that we're getting that sound is by overdriving the hell out of the signal. I've had to leave the overdriving compressor turned on because the moment I turn either of them off, the sound goes away. Now, it doesn't have to be an overdrive into a compressor. In fact, the overdrive can just about do it on its own. If I crank it right to the limit, you can just about hear it. But then by sending that into the compressor, that's further boosting the signal. And in fact, if I bring makeup in as well, then we get an even louder pulse. It's always exactly the same with a fundamental at 1K. And this is just the synthesizer itself kind of humming away in the background. This is an output signal. There's no input to this. This is just the synthesizer generating this sound. So what's causing the pulsing thing? Well, that's actually in the modulation page. If we have a look at the group tab, there's an LFO that's cycling on this pin. Now, group pins can be a little bit kind of knotty to get your head around. Basically trying to think of it as an unattenuated pin is at 1. If there's no other effect being applied to that little white circle, then a full signal is going from the input to the output. From that point onwards, everything that you do to that pin is an attenuation. You're taking stuff away. So these values here are amounts of attenuation being applied to that control. Now, one of them is an LFO, which means it's cycling up and down from 0 up to 0.361. The reason why we've got an offset is to give us some headroom. If the LFO is cycling and your center point is at maximum, is at 1, then the LFO can actually only have half an effect. Half of the time it's going past 1 and there is nothing past 1. So the offset's bringing the headroom down and then giving the LFO a new kind of baseline upon which to play, and then it's modulating up and down from there. But what's it doing? Well, it's simply changing the amount of output signal being allowed out of output channel 2. That's it. This pin is controlling the signal that's feeding from channel 1 directly into channel 2. Now, it sounds like it's a tone, but it actually isn't. It's the changing of voltages that we're hearing, and I can prove that by switching to a square wave. Because now the voltage changes when the duty cycle goes from positive to negative are abrupt and severe, and so you only actually hear any sound at all when there's a change in voltage. And if you've got your rate set to 1 bar, you're actually going to hear a change in control voltage every half a bar as it goes from at the beginning of the duty cycle to the middle here, and then that's it. That's basically one step done. If I increase this speed, you're going to hear more and more pips. But even at its fastest level, it never gets to the stage where it's generating that constant tone. You're just hearing 64 pips there. When I go to a more varying signal, like a sine wave, then the voltage is constantly being changed. And because it's constantly being changed, all of those little voltage changes turn into a sine wave. Well, it's not, whatever this kind of shape is. And the variance is caused by the fact that it's a sine wave. Sine wave is a constantly changing modulation amount. It's not linear. One final point to mention, channel 1's level has absolutely nothing to do with it. So this is a pre-fader connection. If the pin was basically post-fader or post-knob, then as I change this value, you'd hear a difference of volume, and we don't. That's all for this one. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please consider subscribing, hit notifications, I'll catch you for the next one. Thanks very much.